If there's one thing in medieval medicine that everyone kind of knows about, it's the four humours of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. These four substances and their effects on the body and mind have permeated Western culture and continue to inform how we think about or describe certain character traits even to this day. It's really no surprise that the impact has been so strong, seeing as how the four humours were the backbone of medical theory for nearly 2,000 years. But what are the four humours? Where do they come from? And do they still have a part to play in contemporary astrology? And do they have any relevance today? Find out the answer to this question and more in what's obviously a four-part series. The theory of the four humours is based primarily on the theory of the Greek four elements, introduced by the philosopher Empedocles. It wasn't actually until much later that the four humours were sort of standardized by Galen in the 2nd century CE due to the popularity of his commentary on the Hippocratic text on the nature of man, which sort of endorses this four-fluid framework. The idea goes that if everything in nature is made up of different mixtures of the four elements of air, fire, earth, and water, then people must be as well. Except that in the bodies of humans and animals, it doesn't manifest as literal air or fire, the literal elements themselves, but the elements manifest instead as the four humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, each substance being the equivalent of one of the four elements. These four fluids, called humours, were drawn upon heavily in early medicine, where due to the influence of the Hippocratic corpus, health and disease were conceptualized as balance or imbalance in these four fluids. To be healthy, one had to have their humours balanced, and this was maintained primarily through moderation, such as in a healthy diet or good lifestyle choices. Improper diet was likely to cause the four humours to go out of whack, resulting in illness or general feelings of unwellness, and getting well again meant putting the four humours back into their proper proportions or in their proper places in the body, either through corrections in diet and lifestyle or through drugs. Certain disease types were associated with different humours, such as excesses in yellow bile were associated with things like hemorrhoids, headaches, and fevers, while issues with phlegm were more associated with things like diarrhea, lethargy, and poor circulation. These were primarily attributed based on the energetic system of the four primary qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. This system of energetics was adopted very early in the Hippocratic corpus and had a huge influence on the way things were conceptualized. We're even influenced by this system today when we categorize people as extroverts or introverts, for example, hot versus coldness.
Before going into detail about the four qualities and their characteristics and combinations, we need to take a step back and talk about a couple of related but distinct ideas. These will be more important when we're talking about things like the applications of the four qualities with like interpretive principles in astrology, but are worth going into now before we really go into the whole system. The first is that the four primary qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness are called primary because they are the highest or the first form of manifestation, and all other things in this world are some kind of manifestation of one or a combination of these four qualities. Most famously, the elements, which we will talk more about later in the video, result from a combination of these four qualities, and then they go on to kind of make up the rest of the natural world in Greek philosophy. That isn't all, though, as we know that heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness were not the only qualities discussed as being significant. The pre-Socratic philosopher Anaxagoras talked about how the hot and the cold, the dry and the wet, the bright and the dark, and the rare and the dense were all qualities that were present in the original mixture of the universe. Bright and rare would go on to be considered secondary to heat, while dark and dense would be considered secondary to cold. So all observable or interactable characteristics, and even those that aren't, are actually derived from one of these four qualities. So physical characteristics like temperature, color, texture, and size are all made possible because they are manifestations of a dominant primary quality of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. But even non-physical things like expression and gender ideas come from these as well. The other thing is the idea of first principles, which is basically a cosmological hierarchy of these various manifestations and how close they are to the pure form of these primary qualities. First principles were first talked about by Galen, but developed more by the later Arabic authors and are basically a hierarchy of purity for the different manifestations of these qualities. If we take heat as our example, then the first principle, or the most unadulterated form of heat, is just kind of pure heat, like heat with a capital H, heat. This is something like a pure or spiritual heat that we on Earth, as part of the material world, will never really get to experience. The sensation that we experience as heat is actually the next step down, or heat plus a material object. Like, the only way we're able to interface with heat is when it combines itself with a physical thing, like heat plus air makes the hot air we feel on a summer day, or heat plus pan makes a hot pan on a stovetop. Our next step down on our first principles ladder are the seasons. Heat manifests sort of globally or climactically as summertime. Next, heat manifests as physical fire, which is not the same thing as like the pure elemental fire. And then finally, as the yellow bile or the choleric humor in the body. So that's sort of the basic materialization stepladder for the qualities. The first is the pure quality, and then the quality directly mixed with a physical thing, followed by the corresponding season, element, and humor.
The 4 humors were each associated with a pair of these primary qualities. Blood is hot and wet, yellow bile is hot and dry, black bile is cold and dry, and phlegm is cold and wet. These qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness essentially serve as condensed keywords to convey meaning and powers of the humors and the diseases their dysfunctions can give rise to. Dysfunctions of blood and yellow bile, the 2 hot humors, are more likely to manifest as heat in the body, such as fever, redness, inflammation, and swelling, while diseases of the black bile and phlegm, which are our 2 cold humors, are going to show up as things like chills, cramps, hardening, and congestion. It's the 4 qualities that we're going to spend our time on in this first part. Not only do they have a huge influence on medicine and natural philosophy, but also we see them a lot in astrology as well, where we use these words to describe signs and planets. These 4 qualities, heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness, serve primarily as keywords. We're supposed to unpack them to get a better understanding of what they're trying to convey, or how they are applicable in various situations. You probably already have some familiarity with the concepts these keywords convey, as you probably already use them in idioms and figures of speech without really even being aware of it, such as somebody being hot under the collar or cold-hearted. The meanings associated with the 4 qualities were sort of codified in the works of Aristotle, primarily in his works on generation and corruption, but had obvious uses and connotations before this work even came out. Perhaps most jarring and most dramatic, heat is associated with life, and coldness tends to be associated with death in its very early stages. You probably noticed that living things produce a heat, while those things that have died are cold or lack this heat. Furthermore, the Greeks would associate heat with particular emotions, such as joy and relief, while coldness tends to be used more to describe feelings of fear. This is a connection that we even retain in our current language, such as to be frozen with fear, or to feel a chill run up your spine, which are essentially just metaphoric ways to talk about feelings of fear. Moisture and dryness were also associated with life and death respectively, such as with wood, for example, which becomes dry and hardens when it dies, but living wood is still green and pliable, and has a certain moisture to it, such as, with thin branches. If you crack them open, you'll see the green and the moisture inside. Certain parts of the human body are also conceptualized as being dead in a sense, such as the hair and the fingernails, which are also described using dry type words, while living tissue obviously maintains a certain moistness to it due to the presence of bodily fluid. These life and death associations between the 4 qualities would also go on to classify them either as nutritive or life-affirming, such in the cases of heat and moisture, or noxious or life-denying, which are the cold and the dry qualities. If you took a plant and you put it in a warm and moist environment by exposing it to sunlight and providing it with water, that plant is going to grow and thrive. But if you take a plant and you put it into a cold and dry environment by denying it sunlight and denying it water, it's going to wilt and, obviously not flourish. So even before we moved into Aristotle's more descriptive uses of the 4 qualities, we already have a fairly decent stack of things that we can say about the qualities, usually in regards to those that are either conducive or non-conducive to growth. But we also have some meteorological associations to explore as well, heat and dryness being obviously associated with the sun, the summertime, and the daytime, while coldness and moisture tend to be more associated with the ocean, with winter and nighttime. After Aristotle, we start to see the qualities get more fleshed out and associated with words that we more readily understand and see in astrological interpretation, for example, and we're going to take them one by one, beginning with heat. Heat and coldness are really the most obviously apparent in their meanings. At its core, heat is about the activating, expanding, and refining actions. When you introduce heat into a system, you energize it, you introduce energy, and heat is associated with motion, expression, and action. Very basically, heat is the extroverted principle. It wants to move outwards, it wants to take up more space, and it wants to do more things. Heat is not only active and expansive, it also possesses a refining or a thinning quality, which is best exemplified in how heat treats substances or how those substances react to being put under heat. Boiling liquid water is thinned and turned into steam. Solid wax turns into clear liquid when heated, and metal ingots are turned into a molten form. This melting action that things tend to undergo after exposure to heat is often seen as refining it and allowing impurities to be removed from it in this process. Coldness, on the other hand, is passive, condensing, and solidifying. Coldness is patient and soothing. It's low energy, it slows things down, it allows time to pass and things to mature properly. It's about reduction and concentration, and it's more or less the introverted principle, as it's much more focused on moving inwards. Coldness also has a thickening or a solidifying action. As you cool things off, they become thicker and more solid, such as obviously the case of water, which freezes into solid ice. Wax will solidify into a candle, or molten metal will become solid once again. While heat turns the material into the immaterial, it is coldness which condenses the spiritual into the physical. This makes one of coldness's main actions materialization. It is coldness which allows the plans and ideas which are sparked or originate from heat to become practical steps which turn into the attainment of a goal or an objective. Heat is flying by the seat of your pants, coldness is following the instructions. Heat executes on instinct, coldness considers the ramifications before making a move. In astrology, heat and coldness are associated with signs and planets. The fire and air signs are considered hot, alongside the Sun, Jupiter, and Mars, while the water and earth signs, as well as the Moon, Venus, and Saturn, are considered to be cold. Mercury is changeable and can be either hot or cold. It depends on their configuration in a specific chart. But naturally, Mercury is considered to be more cold. It just doesn't happen very often that Mercury is alone and uninfluenced by another planet to express this natural coldness. So you can already see a pretty good distinction between how the qualities of heat and coldness inform the signs and the planets they are associated with. Even just focusing on the elements themselves, you can see how heat is associated with those elements that lack solid forms, while coldness is part of the elements who have more tangible bodies. This is a manifestation of those thinning and thickening actions. So the fire and air signs, as well as the Sun, Mars, and Jupiter, are more outwardly focused and are more expressive, more associated with extroversion and action than the cold planets. The water and earth signs and planets are more internally focused. They're more subdued and are more passive, reflective, sensitive, and responsive to their surroundings. Consider the signs Aries versus Taurus, for example. Aries' keywords are more things like impulsive, energetic, loud, and high-spirited, while Taurus is usually more associated with keywords like patient, practical, stubborn, and mellow. So the hot and cold dichotomy is pretty easy to understand. It's basically introversion and extroversion, or yin and yang, with some spiritual and material aspects in there as well. Moisture is one of the nutritive qualities, so we know that it's more life-affirming and more growth-oriented of the two. Moisture is connective, flowing, and limitless. Basically, moisture is about similarity and comparison. It connects or brings two things together by highlighting what all those things have in common. Moisture pulls things together and makes that whole more than the sum of its parts. Moisture is things like compassion, it's understanding, it's sympathy. Overall, moisture tends to be very socially motivated and emotionally intelligent, but it's also more messy and less distinct and basically more unfocused. Moisture being described as flowing speaks to the natural flexibility and easygoingness associated with the quality. Think about how water sort of easily maneuvers around obstacles. It's not a big deal, it just finds a path of least resistance and, goes around. It's also described as limitless, and this has to do basically with being contained. Think of like outside of the box style thinking, finding loopholes, or bending the rules. There's an element of like, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to do this, but nobody has specifically told me that I couldn't, so here we go. That's associated with moisture. It's a little bit mischievous. Not having a limit also has to do with the form of the moist elements, air and water. They lack distinct shapes and will take on the shape of their containers. Dryness is, of course, the opposite to moisture in almost every respect. Dryness is separative, resistant, and limited. Dryness is more about the organizational or taxonomic principles. It wants to define everything, slap a label on it, both figuratively and literally, watch out giving a dry person a label maker, and put that thing where it needs to go with other things that are like it. If moisture is the comparative principle that brings things together based on commonality, then dryness is the contrasting principle and kind of pulls things apart based on perceived differences. When moisture is introduced to a system, things stick together. Think of like wet sand or wet hair, which kind of becomes one big glob. But when moisture leaves that system and dryness dominates, the system kind of starts to fall apart. Things become more individuated, such as, the individual grains of sand that kind of slip through your fingers as you try to hold them, or like individual hairs on your head that could become a little more separate and distinct as it dries. Dryness is organization, it's structure, individual identity, focus, and logical or rational intelligence. It's very detail-oriented and very by the book in its approach to things, so you see where the rigidity comes into play. Dryness doesn't like change, but once it gets settled into basically an operational procedure, it's very hard to get dryness to alter that. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. Consider how the dry elements of fire and earth handle obstacles that either consume them or they roll them over. There's no real room for compromise. It's mostly a power struggle. Bringing in the emotional versus the rational dichotomy here, dryness then becomes more or less the antisocial quality, which is true. Dryness is literally about separation and distinction, so that connection that kind of drives social relationships is pretty foreign to dry things. Dryness also leaves a lot of the opportunities for friction, which is not comfortable, obviously, and it can be difficult for dryness to see another point of view, relate to another person, or put themselves in somebody else's shoes. The limited aspect of dryness is important and plays into almost everything that we've already discussed. Dryness imposes limits or labels on things and draws a line in the sand about at what point a thing is no longer a part of that sort of taxonomic classification. Like what are the essential characteristics of a chair, and at what point then, as we alter those qualities, does it stop being a chair and start being something else, like a stool, for example? What are the differences between a stool and a chair, and at what point do we cross that line? That's something that dryness is very interested in. Compare this to the forms of the dry elements. Fire and earth have very distinct shapes. They aren't altered very easily without destroying something, either itself or something else to power that thing. We either add more fuel to the fire to cause it to grow, or, like chiseling off or separating pieces of stone from each other to get a new shape of stone. Obviously, it's much more difficult and involved than just putting water into a different shaped glass. Astrologically, we recognize dryness and moisture in half of the signs and planets as well, just like with heat and coldness. The fire and the earth signs, as well as the sun, Mars, and Saturn, are dry, while the water and the air signs with the moon, Venus, and Jupiter are wet. Mercury, again, can be either, depending on how they're situated in a natal chart, but if Mercury is unaffected by another planet, if Mercury is just kind of chilling out by itself, then Mercury is considered more dry. That doesn't happen very often, but that is sort of Mercury's natural disposition when it does. The dichotomy here is either rational versus emotional, or social versus isolative. Either way you want to look at it, it's fine. Fire and earth signs and planets are less emotionally intelligent, and while fire is more extroverted and you would think would make it more socially conscious or, aware of social norms and things, the relationship isn't quite the same, because fire is usually only interested in one thing, on one specific relationship dynamic, and that is leadership and control. Water and air signs are more about equality and genuine emotional connection. And I'm not saying, please don't take out from this, that all the fire signs in your life are trying to dominate you or be the boss. People are not signs or elements, they're people, and multifaceted beings at that. But control is another great way to view dryness, especially through the lens of the dry planets, Mars, Sun, and Saturn, who are very much about control and sometimes domination in different respects. Notice also that the two classically malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, are part of the dry team. The wet planets, by contrast, the Moon, Venus, and Jupiter, are more about being socially conscious and supportive. They're more emotionally intelligent and more freedom-giving. Notice here also that this group contains the benefic planets, Jupiter and Venus. So we see how the four qualities and their individual properties shape or inform the characteristics of their elements, their signs, and the planets that are associated with them. These are the basic building blocks not only of Greek natural philosophy, but also Greek medicine and Greek astrology. The four qualities don't just work individually, though they can, but they also work in pairs, and this is how they form the four elements. Elements cannot form from opposing qualities, so there's not an element that is both hot and cold, or moist and dry. That'd be pretty neat, but it's not happening. But they can combine as either hot and moist, hot and dry, cold and dry, or cold and moist. Let's say you gave different pairs of these qualities to sort of 4 different philosophers, and you put them each in different rooms. You gave them, so much time and told them to make you something with those qualities. So you go to your first room where you gave the philosopher the qualities coldness and dryness, and he shows you a rock because he's made the earth element. The earth element is cold, which is passive, thickening, and solidifying. Rocks, they're pretty passive. They don't do a whole lot, and they have a lot of inertia associated with them. They don't just move around on their own. There aren't, herds of roving rocks going across the plains. They're also really solid and tangible. I can't put, a part of myself through a rock. It's pretty unyielding. In that regard, it's just solid rock. Earth is also dry, which is about imposing limits, and this element is very limited and defined. A rock's body, a rock's shape is all that it has, and there's really no trick to it. The only way to change or alter that shape or the form of the rock would be to chisel off parts of it, or conversely to throw clay or mud onto it to add to it. Moving into the second room where you gave the philosopher coldness and moisture, he gives you a glass of water, since this is the element that he's produced. Water is cold, which is passive, thickening, and solidifying, and water is tangible. It's perceptible. We can see it, we can touch it, we can interact with it, we can move it with our hands and our bodies. Water is also pretty passive. It doesn't move around on its own, it just kind of follows gravity and goes with the flow, as it were. Unlike Earth, though, water is moist instead of dry. Water is coldness without the limitation of form. So while I couldn't alter Earth's shape or substance without physically damaging it, essentially, water's form is much easier to alter. It doesn't have to lose a part of itself to change its shape. You can simply change the shape of its container. In one glass, the water might be more round, while in another glass, the water may take on more of a square shape to mimic, the container that it's in. If I wanted to make the rock's shape more round or square shaped, I'd have to shape it myself by removing parts of it. From here we go into our third room where we gave our philosopher heat and moisture. You walk into this room, you don't really see anything, so you're just like, where's the element? And the philosopher just says, it's everywhere, and you just kind of have to sit down because that's the most profound thing you've heard in weeks, because this philosopher has produced the element of air. Air is a hot element, which is active, thinning, and refining. Air is a thin element. It's a gas. It has no weight. It's intangible. I can still perceive it. I can feel it as I wave my hands through the air, but it doesn't resist me anywhere near the same levels as water and earth do. It doesn't slow me down. It doesn't really get in my way. It moves out of the way and makes way for me. Air is also an active element. It has its own motion, either as wind, which moves from high to low pressure, or as smoke, which just sort of leisurely wafts through the air. Air is also a moist element and has no boundaries. There's no physical form or proper definition of the form of air. It fills the shape of its container in a way similar to water, container being, of course, the room or house that it's in. Air is the shape of the room that it's in, while also making space for the objects that are already placed in the room. Finally, you head into our last room where you gave the philosopher the qualities of heat and dryness, and he hands you a flame as he's created the element of fire. Fire is hot, so it's an active, thinning, and refining element, and we see that activity in fire very easily. The flame itself kind of moves on its own. It pulses and it bounces, and we refer to this as the flame's flicker. The flame also stretches upwards towards the sky. Fire is also pretty thin. You can stick things through it, but not yourself because that's dangerous. And there's no resistance from the fire other than, it trying to burn you. And it just kind of gives away and burns whatever you give it. Fire is also a dry element, so it's separative, it's resistant, and it has boundaries which it will enforce. The body of the flame is what it is, and there's really nothing you can do to change or alter that without giving it something to feed on or, trying to snuff it out. This is similar to Earth's method, which involved adding or subtracting to change its form and shape. And it isn't the same flexible boundlessness that we saw with air and with water. This much fire or earth can only be this much and in these shapes, but water and air can be the same amount in any number of shapes. Qualities don't just come together to create the elements, though. They also make the humours in people and animals and the associated temperaments. Join me next time for a deep dive into the 4 temperaments, their elemental connections, and the personality types they produce.